everybody to listen to me this morning. I want you to put your cell phone away, put it down in your pocket, under your chair. If you're sitting next to someone who is distracting to you, now is your time to get up and move to a new place so that you can hear what God has for you today. That is how I start every Wednesday night, pretty much. So, sorry, I know that I'm not talking to a bunch of teenagers, although sometimes I think as adults, we can use the same reminders that we don't need to be distracted by the things that are outside of this place as we step in and we're on holy ground this morning. And that's one of my favorite things that we say to our dancers when we're preparing for a program and we come into this sanctuary. We step on this. This is holy, holy ground. And how blessed are we that we have and serve a God who wants to meet us in our everyday lives. So what if I told you this morning that God is asking for your participation? And then I asked you, are you going to answer him? Do you have a favorite person in the Bible? I mean, besides Jesus, right? I mean, he should probably be all of us. That should be our favorite, right? But besides Jesus, do you have a favorite person in the Bible? For me, one of those people that I love is Moses. He's a personal favorite of mine. It's because I find him really relatable. Not the plague thing or the parting of the Red Sea thing, but specifically, I'm going to talk this morning about the burning bush thing. In Exodus 4:13, Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." Can you relate with that in your life? Come on, God, please, can't you send somebody else? It's right up there with, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Phillippians 4:13. I mean, as long as it's not hard, right? God, as long as you're not asking me to do anything hard, I can do anything through your strength. It's easy. It's really easy to have faith in God and to trust him when we're just sitting on the couch binging some Netflix. And the truth is, I think that that's where most of us can kind of relate with Moses. Right? Telling God no, or dragging our feet, whining a lot. Moses does a lot of whining. Hoping that God will just eventually get the message, get fed up with us, give up, and just change his mind and move on to somebody else. As I was studying this, I started to wonder if maybe the idea of God as our Father comes from the fact that we act like little children all the time. Like, have you dumped the garbage yet? I will when I finish this episode. Or, have you went and talked to Pharaoh yet? I will, as soon as I'm done roasting these marshmallows. I mean, we have this argument with God all the time on what I'll do if he does this for us. And I think that's exactly what Moses was going through in that time, right? God had gotten Moses' attention. He was paying attention. That bush was burning, and it was now speaking to him. And let's look at what God was asking of Moses. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of the slave drivers, and I am concerned with their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land and into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Exodus 3:7-10. The first thing here that I think we can notice is that God has said a lot about what he's done and what he's going to do. And he talked very little in regards to Moses. God has seen their oppression. God has heard their cries. God knows their suffering. God has come down, and God intends to rescue them. God is providing a new homeland, and God is sending Moses. Moses was supposed to go and lead, but it's God who's going to deliver his people, and he wants Moses to lead them in what's going to happen next. I mean, really stop and think about that. Who wouldn't want to be a part of that? And next comes one of my very favorite conversations in Scripture. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3:11. You see, Moses knew who he was, right? We all know the story of Moses in the basket in the river, right? We all learned that downstairs in children's church. So Moses knew who he was. He had spent the last 40 years defining himself, right? He already had tried to deliver his people 40 years ago, and we know how that ended. It ended in murder and him being rejected by his people. That's the event that drove him into the wilderness in the first place. He was an exiled murderer, and he just knew in his heart that God was talking to the wrong guy. Right? But God tells Moses exactly who he is. Or does he? God answered in Exodus 3:12a, and he said, "I will be with you." God doesn't really tell him who he is, but God tells him what he needs. I will be with you. God is saying, I will be with you. Who you are on the outside of that isn't any concern to me. Your identity, get this, your identity, Moses, is tied to my presence in your life. Everybody here, your identity is tied to God's presence in your life. God hasn't called you because of who you are. If you take nothing away but this today, hear me. God hasn't called you because of who you are, but because of who he is. But Moses still didn't get it. He goes on in Exodus 3:13, and it says, Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites, and I say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" Now Moses is talking to God, and he's saying, "Oh yeah, God? Well, who are you then?" You see, Moses had been waiting 40 years. But the Israelites hadn't heard from God in over 400. To them, he was literally just the God of their ancestors, a people long dead and gone. They knew the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but did it mean anything to them anymore? Was God relevant to them now? And that was just a few hundred years earlier. What expectations do we, as God's people, have of God when we look back 2,000 years to when Jesus walked the earth with the disciples? We hear all the stories of the miracles and the great moves of God, just like Michelle was talking to the little ones before she sent him down, talking about the miracles. But is that same God of the miracles still the God who's calling us today? So I guess my question to you this morning is God relevant in your life today? God said to Moses, "I am who I am. And this is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Exodus 3:14 through 15. Here God literally drops the mic, right? He has this phrase, I am who I am. And this is a verb, not a noun. It carries with it the idea of the identification through action. It also transcends time and has been translated by some scholars as I will be who I will be. God is declaring himself the ever-existing one. Who I was then is who I am now and who I will be forevermore in the future. This is not the name that other people call God. The descriptors of his character. It's what God calls himself. This is the name that only God is holy enough to utter. And just like, okay, I'll stop. How many people are Indiana Jones fans? My family are. I know my daughter will watch all those movies, right? Okay, so just like those guys who saw the opening of the ark during Raiders of the Lost Ark, Moses' ears should have exploded and his face should have literally melted off his head, just like in that movie. I thought that was a great visual. So that's God's name, right? I mean, we're talking so huge. Yesterday, today, forever. Then God goes on for another 7 verses, finishing out the chapter as if this should have settled absolutely everything for Moses. Moses should have been like, okay, I'm good now. But God says, no. You'll say this to the people, and then they'll say, okay, and then you'll tell Pharaoh the plan, but I know he's going to say no, and then I'll flex, and he'll finally say yes, and then you'll do this, and that should have settled it. Moses got the whole plan. God gave him the whole plan, but Moses was too broken to fully accept it. He was still too caught up in himself to accept the power and the importance of God's presence in his life. He just knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was wrong about him. And Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Exodus 4:1. And I think this goes back to identity, right? But not what we necessarily think about ourselves. Rather, it's what others think about us. We prejudice ourselves before others even have a chance to. And doesn't that all begin with the idea that I'm nobody that God could ever use? This false humility is the most evil form of pride. Because it says right to God's face, you're wrong about me. I'm not the one you're looking for. You, God, you've made the mistake. When we don't answer God's call, we're saying that we know better than God. Whew. And then God answers Moses' concerns with 3 miraculous signs. God recognizes the game that Moses is playing, and he pulls out all the stops. First, there's this thing with the staff turning into a snake. No, thank you. Then there's Moses' hands turning leprous and then being restored. And then to make sure there's no longer any confusion who is God in this situation, God turns the water from the Nile into blood. And personally, I think that would have made me a little more nervous. But Moses said to the Lord, Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. Exodus 4:10. This verse is often, interpreted as meaning that Moses had a stutter. I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Any introverts in the room who would rather die than stand up here and talk on a Sunday morning? Do I have any introverts in the room? Okay, so I'm going to direct this to you introverts. What if it had more to do with Moses being an introvert and having spent the last 40 years in a desert in the middle of nowhere with nobody but sheep to talk to? I'm not sure. It could be that he had a stutter. But what we know for sure is that Moses lacked confidence in his ability to do what God was calling him to do. Again, he's questioning God's judgment. But I don't really think that Moses was intentionally calling God out. I just think he was afraid. And he was desperately clawing at any excuse he could find that might get him out of God's plan. I think he had become so comfortable with his sheep and the situation that he was in that he didn't want to get up and leave and have to move and take action. Maybe he thought he had too little time left in the world. So why do I need to start a new project now? His time to make a difference had already passed. But the Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who made them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Exodus 4:11 through 12. Doesn't that make you want to weep? God is saying, I made you the way you are. I know what I'm asking isn't easy. Nothing of any worth ever is. My mom has a saying, nothing good in life comes without a price tag. And I love that. Because if you want a good marriage, it's going to take work. You want to raise good kids, it's going to take work. You want to be successful at your job, it's going to take work. You want to have great friends, the relationship takes work. You want to have a good relationship with God, it takes work. So God's saying to him, now let's go. I'm right here with you. I won't leave you alone. Take my hand. We'll do it together. I'll teach you everything you need to know. Does that sound familiar? Have you ever felt that calling from God? Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Matthew 11:28 through 30. God is calling all of us. So how will you answer the call? How did Moses answer the call? But Moses said again in Exodus 4:13, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." After all this message and dialogue we went through with God, Moses saying, please, God, send somebody else. And I think this is where Moses finally resorts to honesty. He's not making excuses anymore. He just didn't want to do it. And Moses was simply afraid. And I think it was this honesty that God had been waiting for. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. And he said, "What about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and Put words in his mouth, and I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform signs with it. Exodus 4:14 through 17. Kind of sounds like a rebuke, right? God's finally like, gonna throw it at you. You're not getting it. That God's so angry, right? Maybe he's punishing Moses by making him share the spotlight now with his brother. But honestly, I think that little portion of scripture is a great motivator. And the motivator is, do what God calls you to do, or he'll get mad, and he's going to punish you. Personally, I've gotten to a place in my life where I've grown really, really weary and tired of being scared to follow God into what he calls me to. Remember that burning bush? I can imagine those gentle, warming flames flashing into a raging inferno in response to Moses' declaration, the scorching heat pushing him back in startled terror. God had finally gotten Moses' attention. He was letting Moses know that he's not going to win this argument. Moses was getting too comfortable standing there talking to that smoldering shrub. And it was time for Moses to feel the heat. Those previous signs were just that. They were God manipulating the world. But this was the experience of the raw power of God. And what does Jesus tell us again? Matthew 11:29, I will give you rest, for I am gentle and humble in heart. Remember, I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. And look at what follows. God again goes out of his way to accommodate Moses. Oh, look, there's your brother Aaron, who just happens to be coming this way. And what do you know? Aaron's a great speaker. What luck. And it says, Aaron was already coming to see Moses before any of this even started. See, nothing's a surprise to God. God is not going to call you to do something without providing you with everything that you need to accomplish it. You may not get everything you want, and it may not be easy, but I can tell you from experience that it is a blessing beyond description. When I was approached, asked to take a leadership position with the teens, in 2018, I was terrified. I had all kinds of reasons why I could not do it, right? First of all, number one, I'm not called to be a pastor. Seems like that one should be like, wash my hands, I'm done, right? But I'm not qualified. I don't have an education in teaching or being a pastor. I'm qualified for this job. I haven't even raised a teenager yet. My kid was still little. I'm not qualified. I'm too busy. I work. I do lots of other things here at the church. I'm a mom. I'm too busy. But I made the commitment to pray about it. And after praying about it, I felt this overwhelming peace from God. And I knew that he would give me what he needed. Do you recognize that sometimes we're called to things for a season? Sometimes we're called to things, if we call ourselves Christians, just because there's a hole. And in order for God to be famous, the hole has to be fit. It has to be filled. There has to be somebody in that position doing it. So, fast forward 6 years, And here we are standing this morning. And I come before you to say, God met me at every single challenge I faced. He never left me. He never abandoned me. He brought people alongside me to serve with me, to teach me, to encourage me. That was God. He's who did that. And then other people being obedient to accept the call that God placed on them to be a part of my team. God showed up in this ministry. And the ministry has continued to grow and thrive. And over these years, we went from small to mega. And we're a little more intimate, running about 60 to 75 right now. And I believe that that's also God's doing, because we're building meaningful relationships with these kids. We've got this great group of volunteers who invest in these kids. Erica, how many people did we have last night? 10, 12, 10? Yeah. So Erica took it upon herself to start hosting once a month a senior high girls night here at the church. She does it all on her own. She knew I couldn't add anything else to my schedule. Michelle's been coming and helping her. And they just bring these girls together and they just love on them. They just bond. They just build relationships with them so these kids know that they have a place and people who love them. God has blessed my obedience. And he has grown me immensely during the journey. I'm excited to say that God is calling me to new things. I'm still listening closely to what he's asking of me. Right now, I believe he's calling me to a period of rest. But I know he's not going to leave me there. And I am beyond thrilled that my friend, a person that I cherish and has been just such a wonderful encourager in my life, Pastor Michelle Jones, is going to be taking over as the head of our teens. Michelle, if I had one thing to say to you about the thing I admire most, is that you are a true servant leader. You demonstrate being willing to do the yuck that nobody else wants to, and to walk through the trenches. That will be the cornerstone of your ministry, because these kids will know that you're never going to ask them to do something that you're not willing to do yourself. I'm so excited that she's called to be a pastor, and that our kids are finally going to have a pastor that is leading them. And I am going to continue to partner alongside Michelle. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not abandoning the teens. I love the teens. That's where grace is. I don't want to miss an ounce of what is happening. But I know that Michelle's going to be able to, with being able to give this her full attention as her career, going to be able to take this ministry to that next level that I just wasn't able to do. We're going to work together and continue to win this generation for Jesus, because my goal is to make Jesus famous in everything that I do. So you might be asking this morning, how do I know if God is calling me? Well, the fact that you're sitting here this morning means God has called you, right? God has called you for something. That's why you're here. And what is it that God's calling you to? Well, my question to you this morning is, what have you been trying to avoid? Because the thing you're trying to avoid is probably the thing that God is calling you to. At least that's how it's usually been for me. What excuses have you been making? I don't have enough time. It doesn't fit in my schedule. Maybe that's what God's calling you to. And I want you to recognize that excuses are nothing that God hasn't already heard before. And just like with Moses, he'll just find a different way. You can keep giving the excuses, but God's going to keep finding another way. Or maybe you're right where God wants you. and you're already doing what he has asked you to do. But you're stressed out and you're burned out because maybe you've been relying on your own strength too much. Or maybe you need to consider what things you need to let go of. It's kind of where I found myself. What did I need to let go of so that I could do what God's really calling me to next? Or maybe you're doing God's will and you're constantly blessed and joyful every second of every day. And if that is you, please see me after service because I need to know what your secret is. Because I haven't found myself there yet. I mean, but really, we know what the answer is, right? Jesus is the answer. It's his strength in us so that we can do what he's called us to. And it's not doing things because we want to out of our own strength. It's doing the things that God calls us to. Because if we do what God calls us to, then there is a peace and an effortlessness. I don't even know if that's a word, but I just used it. That we get to feel. So what does answering the call look like? I can show you one example of answering the call and what it looks like. And that's me following through this morning on sharing this message with you. And what will it look like for you? It's going to be different. I have no idea. Maybe it's to go to another country with the gospel. Maybe it's to go next door. Maybe it's going to the homeless on the street, or maybe it's a family member that you haven't talked to in a long time. Maybe it's that God's given you a testimony and he wants you to share it, but you've been too scared. Or maybe he's leading you to serve in some other way, like the Dean Department, because we always need help. But whatever it is that God has called you to do is between you and God and maybe the other person that he's called you to help. So what's God saying now? God is saying that I have come down to this earth. I have seen through your eyes. I have seen and heard through your ears. And I have experienced your suffering. I came to rescue you from the power of sin in your lives and to lead you into a new kingdom that's flowing with mercy and grace. Now go. God is sending you, he's sending all of us into a world to lead people into a lifelong relationship with him. So I'm going to end with this. Michelle and my church family, I want to leave you with this thought. The way Moses left the people of Israel that he had been leading for 40 years, passing that mantle of leadership to Joshua, Moses, the man who was afraid to talk to Pharaoh, stands before hundreds and thousands of Hebrews, and he declares this: be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God will be with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:6.